So I'm glad to be able to resume our journey through the Jewish year. I apologize that the schedule had been interrupted, but a wedding last week in New Jersey, and then family commitments the weeks before. So hopefully we'll be on track for the next few Mondays until the last Monday in December. So we'll be doing a few social justice issues as part of this journey through the Jewish year, aside from talking about Hanukkah, etc. So, okay, our topic for today is what Judaism has to say about end-of-life concerns. And so I'm just trying to figure out how to start tackling this. So when we talk about end-of-life issues, we're talking about decisions that family members have to make, God forbid, in a hospital, or people make on their own when still healthy about, God forbid, what will happen when the time comes. So planning for the end of life involves a number of issues regarding how do we understand how do we understand what kind of role we can play in determining end-of-life issues. So by that, I mean, let me present it from the Jewish perspective. It seems pretty clear from the Torah and from rabbinic understanding of the Torah and rabbinic sources that God created humanity. From the description in chapter 1, God created man and woman in God's image. And in chapter 2, just out of the earth, God made spring forward Adam, and then from Adam's rib came Eve. So whichever story it is that God in chapter 1 just voila creates everything in the world, including humanity, or the story in chapter 2 of human beings coming from the earth and woman coming from the rib, either story is clear that God is the source of the birth of humanity. That unlike science and biology, which seems pretty clear that the species that exist on Earth today are as a result of a natural biological evolution, right? Single cells split with the right chemicals to form particular multi-cell organisms, which then evolve into a variety of birds, animals, and fish, etc. For the Torah, it's not like that. That we are the result of a gift of God, that God caused us to come into being. And so therefore, our attitude towards our body is an attitude, one of thanking God for the gift of our body. So we have the responsibility to care for our body as if it is a treasure, as if it is a gift from God, that we cannot understand our body as our own, but rather as as God's creation. So we have to live a healthy lifestyle. We have to, in order to treat our bodies with the appropriate respect and care, we cannot, so engaging in anything that would be unhealthy and unsafe would not only is it not unhealthy and unsafe, and therefore we shouldn't do it, but also because we would be blaspheming God. We would be involved in heresy if we were engaged in unhealthy activities, because we would be desecrating God's gift. So our body is a gift from God. We have to live a healthy lifestyle accordingly. We shouldn't tattoo our bodies, because that is a desecration of God's gift. We don't embalm our bodies after a person dies, because that's a desecration of God's gift and impedes the natural decaying process. We don't cremate, because the same thing. It's a desecration of God's holy article. And so all of that approach understands then that how holy life is and how holy our bodies are. And so the one element of understanding what kind of role we can play in end-of-life issues is this understanding that our body is holy, and we have to do everything we can, everything possible, to keep the body alive, because it is as if we're keeping a part of God alive. Yet, at the same time, and almost in a completely opposite understanding, is a just as important rabbinic understanding that when a person clearly is dying, one has to let the person die, and one cannot prevent or do anything to slow down a person from dying. So there's a classic story in the Talmud of a person on his deathbed and hearing wood being chopped outside. And somehow the chopping of the wood is preventing that person from dying, and that the wood chopper has to stop what he's doing in order to allow the person to die. Now, just a couple of things about this. The rabbis clearly did not know, because they were not advanced medically and scientifically. They did not know for certain that someone was dying. Yet there is a category in Hebrew called goses, gimel, vav, samach, samach. That is a person who is on his deathbed. How long someone is a goses is unclear. Can you be a goses for a year? Can you be a goses for a week? Is it usually it's a day or two? But how do you know for sure that someone is on his or her deathbed? So there's a fine line between doing everything humanly possible to keep someone alive, and at the same time, knowing when someone is on their deathbed, letting that person die. And that sometimes happens within an hour. It could happen within a couple of hours. It's today with modern medicine, we leave it up to doctors to inform, and the medical team in a hospital usually is when this happens, that a family transitions from doing everything they can to provide as much medical intervention as possible in order to save a person's life, to then withdrawing that very same medical intervention to let the person die. So please interrupt me at any time with questions or comments, but this is the idea that on the one hand, our body is a gift from God, and therefore we do everything humanly possible to keep to maintain the highest quality of our body, because it is God's gift. We have to, and no matter what happens to us, we have to do everything we can to stay healthy. And for family members, we have to do everything we can to keep a person alive. Whereas at the same time, we have to constantly be in touch with the medical team. God forbid a family member is in the hospital, and to be constantly aware when, after everything has been done medically possible, that that nothing is helping, that at that moment, then it is Jewishly appropriate to withdraw all of that intervention to allow a person to die in peace and die naturally. Okay, so there are those two competing forces that happen all the time. And then there's a third element that complicates the whole thing, and that is very common today, if not suggested for everyone, to have two documents readily accessible for our families, and that is a healthcare proxy and a possible do not resuscitate order. So that it is very common for people in preparing their documents, whether they're in their 50s or in their 90s, but preferably in their 50s, to prepare these documents, not just a will, but a power of attorney and a healthcare proxy, etc., in order so that it's clear for family members to know what the wishes are of people if family members are going to be taking care of their family. And so there are questions that arise in a healthcare proxy that call into question what I just presented. Number one, with a healthcare proxy, you can fill out, you have to answer what level of medical intervention you prefer, so that when the time comes, God forbid, if the time comes, that the family knows for the hospital to intervene all the way or just some of the way. So in other words, let's say, now this how one can't predict ahead of time what the situation will be, God forbid, that a family member will encounter. But let's say someone is diagnosed with a terminal cancer, and there are decisions that family members have to make in terms of what kind of chemotherapy and what other kind of interventions family, the patient, the person will want to have. So depending on the type of cancer, let's say, God forbid, it's brain cancer, which can be very debilitating and usually is. So part of the process of brain cancer could be treatment with chemotherapy, which could result in a person being unconscious or debilitated sooner than if no intervention were to happen. Right? I'm just coming up with a scenario here that will help understand why a family member might want to have a do not resuscitate order or a do not intervene order. So if one is given a clear-cut terminal a terminal diagnosis, is it permissible to say, to write down, I do not want to have chemotherapy because I want to have more quality of life with my family, and that if I have chemotherapy, then that will result in me being in the hospital, or it will result in me being quarantined or being away from my family at a time when I need my family the most. So that it is a question like that that results in great debate among Jewish bioethicists, medical ethicists today, because it gets to the heart of letting someone die naturally without, so a terminal diagnosis, does that automatically make one a gosais? That is someone on their deathbed according to rabbinic law. So the terminal diagnosis, someone could be diagnosed with terminal cancer and still be walking around and doing everything like they normally are doing. This is especially the case when someone's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, for example. Just giving examples like this that can happen, where someone is seemingly healthy 1 minute and is terminal the next minute. Does the terminal diagnosis make one into a gosais so that a person can refuse medical intervention? And that is a debate. There is no easy answer there. Some family members want to convince their family member who has a terminal diagnosis, please do everything you can. You never know, there could be an experimental treatment. We in the Washington area are close to NIH, and there are trials, medical trials that open up all the time. Please consider that as a person with a diagnosis, allowed Jewishly, ethically and morally, to refuse such possible treatment. For the most part, I would say yes. A person should be in control of their own health and status, and if there is and their determination of what quality of life is. And so if it's clear with second opinion, third opinion, that someone is diagnosed with terminal cancer, one has the option to refuse treatment. But then what happens if a person doesn't have cancer, but let's say, God forbid, somebody is in a car accident and intervention is required immediately in order to keep a person alive, and the doctors can't determine yet whether someone is clinically or legally brain dead or not, right? There's that category of how do you know someone has died, and according to the Talmud, it is when the heart stops. But is it when the heart stops, or is it when someone stops breathing? It's possible when someone stops breathing that they're still alive. It's possible when someone's heart stops that they're still alive as well. So with modern medical technology, it's all about brain activity today. So when one is in a severe car accident, and if one has a do not resuscitate order as part of their healthcare proxy, is it appropriate to tell the doctors not to intervene in that way? It is very rare that a family member will be there in the hospital at that particular moment or at the ambulance in time to show the do not resuscitate order to the doctors and tell them not to intervene in that way. So it is less likely and less common to Jewishly say at that kind of example of a car accident like that to allow a do not resuscitate order to be in place for that person. But more likely, it's about someone who's 119 years old, let's say, right? Our lifespan is till 120. So it's someone at 119 to have a do not resuscitate order might make more sense ethically and morally than someone at 30 to have a do not resuscitate order. And in all things being equal is totally healthy, it wouldn't be right to have a do not resuscitate order for a 30-year-old. Okay, so you see there are gradations here and nuances to understanding level of medical care and level of medical intervention. There's also the question of withdrawing treatment while someone is being treated in order to let a person die. So for example, let's say someone has, in the course of hospice, has had a feeding tube inserted. And then they go into hospice. So they have the feeding tube already, and then a person goes into hospice. Hospice meaning that it's palliative care, and a person is on the way to dying. Is it okay to withdraw the feeding tube, knowing that the person will die sooner? Or is one mandated to keep the feeding tube in, and knowing that the person will keep on being fed and there will be nutrition because the person physically can't chew or drink on their own? They need the feeding tube in order to receive nutrition. So is it okay to withdraw the feeding tube to allow the person to die naturally yet sooner? And there is a debate, and there is a healthcare proxy that the Rabbinical Assembly published a number of years ago, 20 or so years ago, that allows for the withdrawal of the feeding tube, and in another column that does not allow for the withdrawal of the feeding tube, because there is a debate within the conservative rabbinate today as whether something like that kind of medical intervention can be stopped and withdrawn. So for me, from my understanding of this, and I think for most rabbis, though it's important to understand the general terminology and the general circumstances, it's important to know what the individual case is, because what is the general circumstance can't always be applied 100% to every single case. So a 30-year-old who was in a car accident is very different from a 119-year-old who is in a car accident. That it just medically might make more sense to intervene because a person is more likely to recover given age and health at one particular stage in life than in another stage of life. Someone diagnosed with cancer at age 100 is going to receive different medical advice than someone diagnosed with cancer at 35, right? So it's just the way it is. So what ethicists who help work with families in the hospital, so social worker, medical team in the hospital, but even more so, what is more helpful, the rabbi, the priest, the minister, to help put this in a religious context, to help understand how to make these decisions and how to feel comfortable with as little a guilty conscience as possible in making these decisions, right? So there are many cases, there are many times that I've been in the hospital, the past 32 years that I've been a rabbi, where I've been with a family and they've just received the diagnosis from the doctor about, the person, let's say a person suffered a heart attack, and they're rushed to the hospital. and system is failing, and the hospital is trying to intervene, and is bypass surgery a possibility? Do we put the person on a ventilator? And then once the person is on the ventilator, is the person showing any improvement or not? And then when it's clear that no other intervention is helping and systems are failing, and the ventilator is the only thing keeping the person alive, that to help the family make the decision that it's okay to pull the plug, right? Because at that very moment, God forbid, we should be faced with such a circumstance. And that very moment when when the family member gives the okay to the medical team to pull the plug, how does the family feel comfortable knowing that they've actually just given the okay to let their family member die? That in some circumstances, you can see that as actually, it could be emotionally understood as killing their family member, because you're pulling the plug, you're turning the power off to the thing that's the only thing that's keeping the family member alive. This heart-rending, emotionally challenging situation is a common situation. Like I've said, I've dealt with it with families many times, and it's very, very difficult. Even as someone, as an outsider, as the rabbi coming in to provide objective advice, you can't help but knowing the person who's in the room and the family members are in the room, that how difficult and nearly impossible it is to make a decision like this. And all we have to help us make this decision is knowing that we are treating this person as a holy vessel, that all of us are holy vessels. And at the same time, we have to understand that we are human beings. We are not God. We are not immortal. So we are God-like in that we are holy vessels, but we are mortal because we are human beings. And we have to weigh at the same time our mortality and the decisions that we make that concern our mortality, while understanding that we are holy. So to make the decisions about mortality in a holy spiritual way, that's what we have to juggle all the time. And that is the ethical religious challenge that we face. So I'm going to stop here. Any comments or any questions? Steve, you look like you're about to, yes.
Yeah. So would you comment on Jewish views of medical assisted suicide?
Right. Okay, good. So Dr. Kevorkian and other such things. Right. So medically assisted suicide. So there's a difference, a quantifiable difference between having a healthcare proxy, and that is decisions about treatment, versus or refusing treatment, versus actually taking the other step in the other direction, the proactive step of ending your life. So I don't know anyone within the conservative movement, and I don't know any, I'm not sure if this is a thing even in any denomination of Judaism, that would allow for or find any way spiritually, Jewishly, to allow for medically assisted suicide. Because it's one thing to withdraw treatment. It's one thing to make decisions that allow a person to die on their own, or even by withdrawing the feeding tube that quickens death in hospice. That's so recognizing that this is a slippery slope. It's one thing to withdraw treatment or refuse treatment, which is very different from proactively making the decision to die. Okay, so I'm trying to present this, even just with my body language to show the two sides of the coin here. So withdrawing treatment, refusing treatment is different from the proaction of taking a pill or having an IV inserted that will cause death to happen imminently. So medically assisted suicide, no matter how traumatic and no matter how much a person is suffering, I do not see a way that I could, if I was asked for my opinion, to condone medically assisted suicide. I've known people who have suffered enormously from pain, and that they are in pain constantly, unimaginable pain, that they barely are able to make it out of their house, or they can't even make it out of bed because they're in so much pain. And they just want to be given permission to take a pill to end it all, because there's nothing doctors can do to end the pain. And there's nothing I can do. Now, if someone in that circumstance, it used to be the case that the tradition was that if someone committed suicide, they would not be permitted to be buried in the main section of a Jewish cemetery. That there would in old Jewish cemeteries, the edge of the cemetery in the far back, where people would never go to visit, that's where suicides are buried. So that there is this sense that a person who commits suicide is taking themselves out of the Jewish community. And so though I can't find a reason to allow someone to actively do medically assisted suicide, I can't find a way to allow a family member to administer it, or for the patient, him or herself, to be administered that pill or IV. At the same time, I would allow that person to be buried in the main section of the Jewish cemetery. Because with our increased knowledge of mental health and understanding that suicide is a mental health issue, that certainly the person there's a mental illness there, some kind of mental, some emotional aspect of the person's life has been affected by the illness, that they are not in full control and understanding of what they are doing. And so absolutely, they should be buried and given a full Jewish funeral and be buried in the main section of the Jewish cemetery. So though I can't sanction medically assisted suicide, I will allow the other resultant aspects of Jewish ritual. Jules, do you have a question?
I'm curious, seriously, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm seriously curious about a situation in which the patient is hospitalized.
Yes.
In pain breathing.
Yes.
Trouble breathing, which is very obvious.
Right.
And you put them in the intensive care unit of the hospital, or you authorize them to be placed there. And you know that if the hospital calls and says, we have to ventilate the patient to keep them alive, and tell them not to ventilate, because the patient is obviously, while breathing heavily, in extreme pain. sometimes they can express their own wishes.
Right,
Sometimes they can't.
right,
You're always.
right. So that's the question, Jules, is that's why some people have this healthcare proxy, so that family members are authorized to make decisions on behalf of the patient, him or herself. So let's say I write a healthcare proxy and I authorize either my wife as my proxy or one of my children as a proxy, depending on, life circumstance and how old I am, etc. So it depends also on the circumstance that would lead to having to make that decision. So have I been at that point in and out of hospitals because I'm suffering from some kind of disease, God forbid, that is slowly causing my body to be wasting away, so that every time I go into the hospital, I become weaker and weaker, and that is just a matter of time anyway. And so therefore, if I happen to get to the point where I'm breathing heavily and it's painful to be breathing, but could be a sign that the end is near, then it might make sense to have a do not resuscitate, because the being on the ventilator would only be prolonging the inevitable, which the inevitable seems in that situation that I'm describing to be just days, if not maybe at the most weeks away, as opposed to I'm 59 right now, I'm poo healthy, and somehow I get an illness in which I'm breathing heavily. I would hope that a ventilator would be inserted in order to save my life, because otherwise there's no other kind of medical history to show that I am terminal in any way, right? So you see, Jules, it all depends on what the circumstance is in which the person needs the ventilator or not. What medically has been happening before to call into question the need for a ventilator, and that impacts the decision to allow the ventilator to be inserted or not.
Oh, I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Yeah.
You know that if you're sent to a hospice for hospice care,
Yes.
they assume that it is assumed that you're on your way out
Yes.
to the other world.
Yes.
And so the question I have is, what happens when you know that somebody you love a great deal is in a hospice condition?
Right.
And you're not going to resuscitate them.
Right.
But you know, or you should know, that if you're in hospice,
Yep.
the doctors are going to give you morphine,
Right.
to ease your transition.
Yes. So you won't be in pain.
From life into
Yes.
death, not
Yes.
being disrespectful
Right.
of the Jewish approach.
Right.
The question I have is, what do you do about it? If you say, yeah, put her in hospice, put him in hospice, you
Right.
know that you're putting the tag on their toe.
Yes. Now, but
And it's a
Jules,
matter of when.
yes, Jules, absolutely. And so, the challenge with a discussion like this is that I'm talking about cases in an objective, non-emotional way. But clearly, when this happens in our own lives, it's very emotional, and it's very difficult and painful to watch and be part of the process, whether as a patient or the caregiver to the patient. So when the decision to go into hospice usually happens after many, many conversations, hopefully, but among the family members and the patient, him or herself, if the patient is conscious at the time, that everyone understands what the person's wishes are. Everyone understands what exactly is happening medically to the person, that that interventions have been done and they have been fruitless to that point, and further intervention causes more harm than good. And therefore, that's at that point then that the medical team says it would make sense to go into hospice, to allow the person not to be poked and prodded anymore, which would only cause pain and suffering, but rather let's let the person die with dignity, with family around them, without needles, without tubes or anything like that in them. So even at that point, after all the conversations, Jules, it's still painful to watch and be part of. But if everyone in the family who has been in that conversation is all on the same page, it makes it easier. It doesn't make it easy, it makes it easier. And so, yes, it's still hard and painful to be part of the process, but hospice is a very Jewish thing to do. There is Jewish hospice. The Jewish Social Service Agency is known for its hospice care, that's just in our Washington area, is excellent. And there are rabbis who serve as the chaplains of Jessa Hospice, and they are terrific in what they do and helping the family and the patient transition in this way. So yes, so Barbara, what did you?
I'm going back to the fact that you're saying that not to do anything to make death come sooner.
Right, the medical assisted suicide, yes.
But what is the situation when you have somebody that has a breathing problem? Breathing is painful, very painful, but to take pain medication of any sort will automatically kill you because pain medication closes,
I don't,
makes it more
Barbara,
difficult.
you're raising a situation that I'm not familiar with, and so my go-to for a question like this, Barbara, is family needs to talk to medical team to find out how best to provide to keep the person comfortable, and find out if medical intervention. So if whatever the case is, if medical intervention will cause more harm than good, then that is the Jewish case to say, don't do the medical intervention. Okay, so I can't come up with a specific situation to apply that to, but that's the general principle. If the medical intervention does more harm than good, okay, right? So just all things being equal, sometimes the medical intervention does more harm short term, but there's a long-term possibility to recover from it, then the medical intervention should be done. But if the medical intervention does more harm than good, and there is no long-term sense that there is good down the road, right? You're just prolonging, by doing the intervention, you're doing harm, but you're also keeping somebody alive unnecessarily because there's absolutely no other way this person could be alive, then the medical intervention should not be done. Okay, so these are the cases, and every case is unique for the situation in terms of who the patient is, how many family members they have. Are all the family members on board? It's not so unusual for family members to have different opinions about what to do. And that makes it that much more difficult to reach a decision. In other words, one family member could be the one designated as the healthcare proxy and want to make one decision, but another family member is not the proxy and wants to make a different decision. So it's very, very difficult to reach consensus and for everyone to feel comfortable what to do. Steve.
So I saw something at the Clarksburg Cemetery that I'm going to ask you about in a second. I think you said earlier that it's Jewish practice not to cremate.
Yes.
Okay, and I saw something at the Clarksburg that it was a large wall, which I assumed
It has
were,
cremains.
yeah.
Right.
So what's going
Yes.
on there?
What's going on there? Yes. Okay. So there's Jewish law and tradition, and which you would think that all cemeteries and Jewish funeral homes should accommodate. And then there's American law and custom. So in order for a Jewish funeral home to operate in the state of Maryland, and I assume this is the case for all 50 states and the District of Columbia, for a Jewish funeral home to operate, it has to be licensed by the state of Maryland. And Joyce Torchinsky, who's a member of our congregation and runs Torchinsky Hebrew Funeral Home, a Jewish funeral home, has to provide embalming and cremation services because that's what a funeral home has to provide in the state of Maryland. Even though embalming and cremation goes against Jewish law, so Joyce Torchinsky does not provide those services at the Torchinsky Funeral Home in Tacoma Park. She does not provide it there, but if a family requests it, she can't deny it. She has to refer them to some other place that will provide that service for them. So that's funeral home providing the service. So a Jewish funeral home will provide cremation and embalming if the family wants, because the state of Maryland requires it. Okay. Now the cemetery is a different question. Jewish cemeteries, I'm laughing about this, and just because it's just the nature of the beast. The Jewish funerals, the funeral business is business. Okay, that's just what it is. And for Jewish funeral homes to stay in business, they have to make money. And so Jewish funerals are expensive. And some funeral homes will charge a lot of money, and especially for families who wait till the last minute to order a coffin. And some funeral homes and funeral directors will be known for laying on the guilt. You know, I'm sure you'd want your family member to be comfortable in this casket, and they wouldn't be comfortable in that casket. Right? So steering a family away from the plain pine box and paying more for a nicer looking casket. So cemeteries are in the business also. And so for cemeteries to be in the business, they charge for the digging of the grave. They charge for the liner that goes in the grave. They charge for, and if they want to make more money, they'll have a wall there or a room set aside for cremains to be buried. Now think about it. Why is anybody choosing cremation over burial? Usually it's to save money. Usually it's to save money. Some people think it's an environmental thing, right? Why waste land with burying people in the land and not being able to use that land? That's a different environmental impact discussion to have. But so some people will cremate because of environmental impact. But most people cremate because it's a lot cheaper to do. But imagine then burying the cremains, as they're called, burying the ashes. You're spending more money than you originally intended in order to do that. And it's purely for the cemetery to make money. That's all it is. And I'm just telling it like it is, Steve. For why the Jewish cemetery in Clarksburg, Maryland, the newest, the Garden of Remembrance, as it's called, why it would have a section for cremains, it's in order to make money. They might say it's not to turn Jewish families away, and we want to accommodate families in need for any time. And if who are we to tell them that they've made the wrong decision and that we can't do that? That's what they'll say. But really, it's about having an opportunity for the cemetery to make more money. And it goes against Jewish law. I will never, and I have never and will never participate in any way for any kind of service associated with a cremation. That's how much I am adamantly opposed to it. There are rabbis I know who will do the memorial service before the cremation happens. I will not do that. I will have nothing to do with anything with cremation. So that's, and not just that it goes against Jewish law, that from dust we were created, to dust we return, and nothing should impede that natural process. But after the Holocaust, when Hitler threw 6 million of us into the crematoria, how could we do cremation after that? That should be reason enough right there. So I can't, people make decisions, whatever they want to do, but I can make a decision too, not to give my sanction to it. So that's my perspective on Jewish. And so Garden of Remembrance isn't the only Jewish cemetery that has a section for cremains. There are many Jewish cemeteries across the country that will do that. And there are many Jewish cemeteries that are no longer Jewishly owned either. There are Jewish funeral homes and cemeteries that are owned by the funeral home company called SCI, and there's another one too. So they're not even Jewishly owned anymore. So that's even more difficult in doing business with what you think is a Jewish funeral home and a Jewish cemetery, but they're really not Jewish owned, and it makes it harder to do business. Okay, any other questions or comments about this? So I got off my soapbox there. Okay, so important issues about end of life, and I hope everybody stays healthy, stays well, and that this was a theoretical discussion, not to have to be used poo until you're 120. So take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Okay.
And, see you all next Monday.
Yashar.
Okay, thanks.